They said the land was public infrastructure now, but the drone footage showed something else entirely, something that made no legal sense at all from the moment I saw it. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I inherited 9,400 acres of continuous private land in the Western County Line region, a stretch so large it crossed multiple survey zones and had its own recorded environmental boundaries long before any homeowner association existed nearby. I was standing in the county records office when the first notification came through, a construction permit filed under a community improvement initiative I had never authorized, never reviewed, and never even been informed about. The clerk behind the counter looked just as confused as I felt when I asked how a $6 million public park project had been approved inside privately deeded land. She pulled up the registry again, scanning line after line, then paused at the subdivision overlay map that showed something that should not have existed, a fully developed recreational zone marked directly over my property line. That was the moment I knew this was not a misunderstanding. It was a system failure. Across town, Margaret Hollis, the HOA president of the nearby development district, was already giving statements to local contractors, describing the project as a community expansion effort designed to benefit surrounding neighborhoods. She spoke with certainty, the kind that comes from assuming administrative confidence is the same as legal authority. By the time I reached my truck, satellite images were already being circulated among county staff, showing construction equipment moving across open ranch terrain, clearing pathways where no easements had ever been granted. I drove out toward the property line without speaking to anyone, passing mile after mile of open land that had been in my family's control since long before the first residential subdivision was built 5 miles east of it. When I arrived, the scale of the operation hit immediately. Earth movers cutting into soil, survey flags placed without recorded approval, and temporary fencing marking off sections of land, as if ownership had already been transferred through assumption alone. No one stopped working when I pulled up. That was the part that felt wrong. It was not rebellion or defiance. It was confidence built on incorrect paperwork. I stepped out of the truck and stood near the edge of the construction zone, watching workers continue laying foundation lines for what looked like a public recreation facility, walking trails already partially carved into ground that legally belonged to a single deeded owner. The air smelled like fresh soil and diesel equipment, a mix that usually meant progress, but here it felt like a boundary had been crossed without acknowledgement. I called the county office directly, asking for verification of authorization records, and the response I received was hesitant, fragmented, as if the system itself was trying to reconcile two conflicting versions of reality. One version showed private ownership under my name, and another showed a community development permit issued through HOA channels that did not legally extend this far west. I remember standing there with the phone still in my hand, looking at the scale of construction spreading across thousands of acres, realizing that what I was witnessing was not just a dispute over land use, but a breakdown in how authority was being interpreted at every level. And somewhere behind all of it, before any sheriff arrived, before any legal correction could take place, the system had already started to expose its own contradiction in real time. The next call I made was to the county land and zoning office, and this time the response did not carry the same hesitation I had heard earlier, but it still did not carry certainty either. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and as I stood beside my truck at the edge of my inherited 9,400 acres, I listened while a county records analyst explained that the construction permits submitted by the Homeowners Association had been processed through a community infrastructure channel that did not normally cross into privately deeded territory of this scale. The words sounded procedural, but the implication was not. It meant someone had approved movement on land without fully reconciling ownership boundaries, and now that movement had already become physical reality on the ground. Behind me, the construction site continued without interruption, with workers laying marked pathways and temporary structures that suggested a finished public park was already being imagined before legal confirmation had caught up. I could see vehicles moving in coordinated patterns, survey teams adjusting markers, and equipment operators following instructions that assumed full authorization had already been validated. Nothing about it looked uncertain from their perspective. That was the most unsettling part. Across the county line, Margaret Hollis was reportedly holding a coordination meeting with contractors and community representatives, reinforcing the idea that the project was part of a long-approved development plan. I was not in that room, but I could already picture the confidence in her explanation, the kind of confidence built when paperwork is assumed to equal permission. The county analyst returned to the line after several minutes of internal verification, this time stating that a field review would be initiated immediately due to conflicting land registry entries. That phrase changed the tone entirely. Field review meant physical confirmation, and physical confirmation meant someone would have to come out and stand where I was standing now, looking at what had already been built and deciding whether it could legally remain. I watched as another truck arrived at the site, this one not marked for construction but for inspection, and I felt the shift begin even before anyone stepped out of it. The scale of the land made everything slower, decisions, responses, and corrections all stretched across distance that could not be compressed by urgency. I walked a few steps forward along the edge of the cleared ground, careful not to cross into the active build zone, observing how deeply the infrastructure had already taken root despite the absence of confirmed authorization. Stakes had been driven into soil that still belonged under a single deed, and drainage paths had been carved as if the land had already agreed to its own redesign. When I looked back toward the main road, I saw a sheriff vehicle entering the perimeter access point, moving slowly as if it had been instructed to assess rather than react. That vehicle belonged to Sheriff Dylan Mercer, though I did not yet know his name at that moment, only that the presence of law enforcement changed the rhythm of everything around it. The workers began to slow slightly, not stopping, but adjusting their attention toward the arriving authority, waiting for instruction that had not yet been given. I remained where I was, phone still in hand, as the county analyst confirmed that official survey records would be cross-checked on site against physical boundary markers and historical ownership files. For the first time since I had arrived, the situation was no longer expanding forward unchecked, but beginning to turn back toward verification. And in that reversal, I could already sense the point where infrastructure, assumption, and legal record would finally be forced to align. The sheriff vehicle did not rush into the construction zone. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if Sheriff Dylan Mercer understood that speed would not solve what he was about to step into. I stood near the edge of the cleared land, still holding my phone, while the dust from the ongoing construction drifted across the open acreage like a thin veil, trying to cover a mistake that had already been made visible. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and by the time the sheriff stepped out of his vehicle, the entire site had shifted into a state of suspended activity, not stopped, but no longer moving forward with confidence. Workers began to pause their machinery in uneven intervals, some fully stopping, others waiting for instructions that were no longer coming from the same source. Sheriff Mercer did not speak immediately. Instead, he looked across the landscape, taking in the scale of what had been constructed, the marked pathways, the temporary fencing, and the survey stakes that cut across ground that belonged to a single recorded deed. His expression did not show surprise, only measurement, the kind that comes from understanding how large a correction might need to be. Behind him, a second county inspection unit arrived, and with it came a field survey supervisor carrying sealed documents and mapping equipment. I overheard fragments of conversation as they coordinated with the county office, confirming that this was now an active jurisdictional verification event rather than a simple complaint response. That distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment, because it meant the situation had moved beyond interpretation into formal correction. Margaret Hollis was not present yet, but her influence was everywhere in the physical layout of the site, in the way paths had been carved and infrastructure had been positioned as if approval had already been permanently secured. Sheriff Mercer finally approached the boundary line and asked me to confirm ownership verbally, which I did without hesitation, stating clearly that I was the sole recorded owner of the 9,400 acres under current county registry. He nodded once, then instructed the survey team to begin cross-referencing physical markers with official plat records immediately. The team moved quickly, unfolding equipment, scanning markers, and marking coordinates against official county maps that had been pulled directly from archival systems. As they worked, I noticed the first signs of uncertainty spreading through the construction crews. Not panic, not resistance, but confusion, as if they were realizing that the structure they had been building on did not align with the authority they had assumed was behind it. Sheriff Mercer walked the perimeter slowly, occasionally stopping to examine fence lines and cleared soil paths, while the survey supervisor relayed findings in real time to the county office through a secure channel. The report was becoming increasingly consistent. The construction footprint extended far beyond any approved easement, and no valid transfer of land use authority existed for this scale of development. I watched as one of the lead contractors finally approached the sheriff, attempting to explain that the project had been approved through HOA community development channels, but the explanation did not change the verification process already underway. Mercer listened without interruption, then instructed him to pause all construction activity, pending full legal confirmation. The words were calm, but they carried immediate operational effect. Equipment began to shut down across the site in staggered silence, engines winding down one after another until the only sound left was wind moving across open ground. I could see the moment the project stopped being treated as progress and started being treated as a record that needed correction. Somewhere in the distance, vehicles began to arrive along the access road, and I knew that once Margaret Hollis stepped into view, the assumption that had built all of this would finally have to face the reality of what the land actually was. The first official shutdown order did not come from a single voice, but from a coordinated chain of confirmations moving through the sheriff's field command and the county survey team at the same time. I stood near the same boundary line where construction had been paused earlier, watching as Sheriff Dylan Mercer reviewed the latest report feed coming through his radio, while the survey supervisor cross-referenced physical markers against archived county plat records. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and even though nothing around me had physically changed yet, I could feel the entire structure of what had been built on my land beginning to collapse into administrative correction. The construction crews remained in place, but no longer active, some standing beside silent machinery, others waiting for instructions that were no longer being issued. The atmosphere had shifted from production to observation, as if the entire site had been converted into evidence rather than development. Sheriff Mercer finally stepped closer to the central access road and issued a formal instruction to suspend all site operations until ownership verification was fully resolved through county authority channels. His voice was steady, without aggression, but absolute in its procedural weight. Within seconds, the instruction was relayed across multiple channels, and the remaining equipment on site powered down in sequence. Engines that had been running continuously for hours fell silent one after another, until the only remaining motion was dust settling back into the disturbed soil. That silence revealed the scale of what had been happening here, not just a small construction error, but a fully active infrastructure build spread across thousands of acres without finalized legal clearance. I saw one of the lead contractors step away from a half-completed foundation line, looking toward the sheriff as if trying to reconcile what he had been told with what was physically in front of him. Before any further discussion could take place, vehicles began arriving along the main access road, and I knew without being told that Margaret Hollis had finally entered the operational perimeter. She arrived in a black SUV followed by another vehicle carrying members of the Homeowners Association board, stepping out with the same controlled confidence that had likely guided every decision leading up to this moment. She immediately began speaking before fully approaching the sheriff, referencing community development approvals and prior board authorizations, but Sheriff Mercer raised his hand slightly, signaling that the verification process was still active and had not yet concluded. That single gesture changed the tone of her arrival, because it placed her argument outside the current procedural phase. The survey supervisor approached Mercer with updated results, confirming again that no recorded easement, transfer agreement, or county-sanctioned development extension existed for the affected acreage. The words were not dramatic, but they carried finality within the system they belonged to. Margaret paused mid-sentence, looking between the sheriff and the survey team as if rec. The gate locks had already been placed, but the true shift in the situation began only after Sheriff Dylan Mercer ordered a full perimeter documentation sweep across the entire 9,400 acres. I stood near the central access road, watching as field teams spread out in marked vehicles, each assigned to verify boundary integrity against official county registry maps. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for the first time since arriving on my land, the situation no longer felt like an active confrontation, but like a controlled audit of everything that had been incorrectly built upon it. Margaret Hollis remained near the cluster of HOA vehicles, speaking in lowered but urgent tones with members of her board, attempting to maintain coherence in the narrative that had brought them here. However, her words were no longer driving the process. Every instruction now flowed through Sheriff Mercer or the county survey supervisor, who continued comparing physical infrastructure against recorded legal boundaries in real time. As teams moved deeper into the property, they began marking sections of the newly constructed park with temporary identification flags, noting discrepancies between approved development zones and actual placement of structures. What had been presented as a unified $6 million community park was now being broken down into segmented zones of verification failure. I received updates through a direct county channel that additional easement records had been requested from the State Archive Office, and the response confirmed no legal extension existed beyond the original residential perimeter 5 miles east of my land. That confirmation removed the last ambiguity from the situation. Sheriff Mercer then initiated a formal containment directive, instructing that all access points into the construction zone remain secured until a full legal restoration plan could be drafted. This did not involve removal of structures yet, but it established that nothing could be added, modified, or expanded further. The machinery that had been stopped earlier remained silent, now serving as static evidence of an unauthorized build rather than active development. I watched as one of the survey teams placed reference markers along a partially completed walking trail, carefully measuring its deviation from any recorded public infrastructure designation. The precision of their work contrasted sharply with the uncontrolled expansion that had taken place before their arrival. Margaret finally approached the sheriff directly, attempting to present additional internal HOA approval documents. But Mercer reviewed them without expression and handed them directly to the county legal liaison standing beside him. The liaison examined them briefly and confirmed that internal association approvals do not supersede recorded property ownership or county-sanctioned development rights. That statement effectively separated administrative belief from legal enforceability. For a moment, Margaret did not respond. She simply looked across the land, now segmented by markers, vehicles, and official survey lines that had not existed when she arrived. The scale of the correction process was becoming visible across multiple miles of open terrain, showing just how far the construction had extended beyond its lawful boundaries. I remained stationary as another report came through, confirming that a full aerial survey would be conducted to finalize the map discrepancies. Sheriff Mercer acknowledged the update and instructed that all findings be logged as part of an ongoing infrastructure misalignment case requiring county-level remediation. At that point, the situation was no longer about stopping a project, but about defining the legal reality of what had already been built. And as I looked across the vast land now under structured review, I understood that the outcome would not be determined by who built first, but by which record remained valid when every assumption was stripped away. The aerial survey confirmation arrived just after midday, and by the time it was relayed to the field command channel, Sheriff Dylan Mercer had already expanded the containment perimeter to include every active and partially completed section of the unauthorized construction zone. I stood at the central access point of my inherited 9,400 acres, watching as additional county vehicles moved into position along distant ridgelines, establishing reference points that stretched farther than I could visually track in a single line of sight. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and at this stage the situation had shifted fully from dispute to formal remediation, where every structure on the land was now being evaluated against verified legal mapping rather than assumed development authority. The survey teams confirmed through aerial imaging that the constructed park extended across multiple internal zones that had never been designated for public use, crossing boundary layers that existed in recorded county archives dating back decades before the Homeowners Association expansion plan had ever been proposed. That confirmation triggered a secondary directive from the county office instructing all field units to maintain absolute site control until a full legal reconciliation of infrastructure and ownership could be completed. Sheriff Mercer relayed the order without hesitation, and I observed as additional locking teams reinforced the perimeter gates with county-issued seals, ensuring no further entry or modification could occur within the affected acreage. Margaret Hollis remained on site, now positioned near what appeared to be a central gathering point for her association representatives, though the tone of her communication had changed significantly. Instead of coordinated direction, she was now speaking in fragmented exchanges, attempting to reconcile internal approval documentation with the official findings being reported in real time by the county liaison. The legal liaison reviewed the final aerial overlays alongside ground survey data and confirmed that the constructed infrastructure did not align with any recognized development authorization boundary, effectively categorizing the entire project as unapproved land modification pending formal adjudication. As that classification was recorded, I noticed the field crews begin to systematically document every segment of the park, placing numbered markers along pathways, recreational zones, and utility placements that had been installed without verified easement rights. The process was methodical and quiet, transforming what had been presented as a completed community asset into a structured inventory of disputed construction elements. Sheriff Mercer walked the perimeter again, this time accompanied by the survey supervisor, cross-checking physical markers with digital registry overlays on a tablet connected directly to county records. Each comparison reinforced the same conclusion, that the infrastructure extended beyond any lawful jurisdictional allowance granted to the homeowners association. At one point, Margaret approached the sheriff again, holding additional documents that she insisted represented extended board authorization, but Mercer directed them immediately to the county legal liaison, who confirmed after brief review that internal association approvals hold no binding authority over recorded property boundaries or county-regulated land use. That statement was logged officially into the active case file, further solidifying the transition from disputed development to confirmed unauthorized construction review. I could see the scale of the operation more clearly now as teams spread across the 9,400 acres, not dismantling anything yet, but converting every visible structure into documented evidence for legal processing. The construction site, once active and expanding, had become a mapped record of deviation from approved land use policy. As the afternoon light stretched across the open terrain, Sheriff Mercer issued a final procedural update confirming that no further construction, alteration, or access would be permitted until full legal resolution was achieved through county and state review channels. And in that moment, standing at the edge of my land as the system completed its verification cycle, I understood that what had unfolded here was not simply a halted project, but the complete redefinition of what authority meant when it was measured against recorded truth rather than assumed control. The final phase of verification began just after the county legal liaison uploaded the consolidated infrastructure report into the active case system. And at that moment, the entire 9,400-acre site shifted from field assessment into formal legal classification review. I stood at the same central access point where I had first arrived, watching as Sheriff Dylan Mercer coordinated with both the survey supervisor and the county command channel to initiate the final confirmation sequence that would determine the legal status of every structure built across my inherited land. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and by this point the land was no longer being treated as a construction site or a disputed project, but as a fully mapped legal environment undergoing correction against recorded property boundaries. The report confirmed again that the $6 million park infrastructure had been constructed across multiple non-contiguous zones without verified easement approval, and that several of its internal pathways intersected directly with protected private land parcels that had never been designated for public development. As this information stabilized in the system, Sheriff Mercer issued a formal instruction transitioning the case from active containment to administrative enforcement hold, meaning the physical site would remain locked while legal resolution procedures were initiated at the county and state level. I observed as additional county units completed a final sweep of all access roads, placing reinforced seals on each entry gate and confirming that no construction, maintenance, or entry activity would be permitted under any non-authorized request until final adjudication. Margaret Hollis remained present near the central staging area, but her position had changed significantly from operational representative to responding party, as she was now required to submit all documentation through formal legal review rather than on-site negotiation. She attempted to engage the sheriff again, referencing prior board resolutions and assumed development approvals. But Mercer responded only by directing her to the official case file, where every claim would be evaluated against verified registry records. The county legal liaison then confirmed on record that all HOA-issued development authorizations were non-binding outside designated community boundaries and held no authority over privately deeded land of this scale, a statement that was immediately entered into the formal correction log. As that entry was finalized, I watched the survey teams complete their last pass through the northern section of the property, verifying that no additional unrecorded extensions or secondary construction zones existed beyond what had already been documented. The scale of the land made the process slow and methodical, but each confirmation reinforced the same conclusion that the infrastructure project had expanded far beyond any lawful boundary framework. Sheriff Mercer then conducted a final perimeter acknowledgement walk, visually confirming each sealed access point and coordinating with dispatch to ensure long-term containment protocols were active until court-level review could proceed. The construction crews had already fully withdrawn from active operations, leaving behind only marked pathways, incomplete structures, and survey flags that now functioned as evidentiary indicators rather than development markers. I remained stationary as the sun began to lower across the vast acreage, watching the transformation of the land from contested construction site to legally secured investigation zone, where every physical alteration was now tied directly to recorded verification rather than assumed authority. Margaret finally turned away from the central area without further attempt to intervene, her departure signaling the end of on-site conflict and the transition into formal legal proceedings beyond immediate control. And as the last county vehicle completed its perimeter exit and the gates remained locked under sheriff authorization, it became clear that what had unfolded across these 9,400 acres was not simply the stopping of an unauthorized project, but the full restoration of legal order through documented truth applied across an entire landscape. The morning after the final containment order, the entire 9,400-acre property no longer felt like an active site of conflict, but like a secured legal landscape waiting for judicial processing to complete its final stage. I stood near the central access gate where the county seals had been placed, observing how the physical environment had changed not through destruction or removal, but through the quiet certainty of restricted access and formal documentation. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for the first time since inheriting this land, there were no vehicles moving through it without authorization, no construction equipment altering its surface, and no competing voices attempting to redefine its boundaries through assumption. Sheriff Dylan Mercer had already departed earlier that morning after confirming that all perimeter enforcement protocols were stable and that the case file had been transferred to the County Legal Review Division for long-term adjudication. The survey teams had completed their final sweep overnight, and their findings were now fully integrated into the official registry correction request, which meant every marker placed across the land had transitioned from temporary field notation into evidentiary mapping. As I walked slowly along the edge of the main access road, I could still see faint impressions in the soil where heavy machinery had once operated, but even those traces now felt like historical records rather than ongoing activity. The construction of the $6 million park had not been dismantled yet, but it had been formally classified as unauthorized infrastructure pending legal resolution, which effectively froze its existence in its current incomplete state. Across the distance, the temporary fencing stood motionless, no longer representing development zones, but rather boundary indicators under active legal review. I received a final status update from the county liaison confirming that all homeowners association claims had been logged and forwarded for compliance evaluation, and that any further communication would now require official legal channels rather than field engagement. That message marked the complete transition from operational conflict to administrative closure, and with it, the last remaining uncertainty surrounding authority had been fully redirected into institutional process. Margaret Hollis had already left the area the previous evening under voluntary departure advisement, and her absence was now recorded as part of the formal case timeline, indicating the end of on-site representation for the homeowners association. What remained was not confrontation, but consequence in procedural form, spread across documents, maps, and verified record. The final legal closure report arrived 3 days after the containment order, and it marked the moment when the entire 9,400-acre property transitioned from active dispute into officially resolved land use correction within the county system. I stood alone at the central access gate, where the sheriff's seals were still intact, and reviewed the printed summary delivered by the county liaison earlier that morning. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and the document confirmed in clear legal language that all infrastructure constructed under the Homeowners Association initiative had been classified as unauthorized development on privately deeded land, with full jurisdictional authority reverting exclusively to recorded ownership and county regulatory oversight. There were no more active teams on site, no survey crews, and no enforcement units remaining in the field. Sheriff Dylan Mercer had submitted his final operational report, stating that all enforcement actions had been completed in accordance with county protocol and that no further field intervention would be required unless new legal filings emerged. The $6 million park structure, once treated as a community expansion project, was now formally designated as non-compliant infrastructure pending administrative review, with all access permanently restricted until court-level determination concluded its final ruling. I walked slowly along the edge of the main road, noticing how the absence of machinery and personnel had fundamentally changed the perception of scale across the land. What had once been an active construction zone spanning miles was now a silent expanse of marked boundaries, sealed gates, and documented reference points that existed only within legal mapping systems. The physical remnants of the project remained in place, but their meaning had shifted entirely from development to evidence, from progress to record. I received a final confirmation message from the county registry office stating that all corrections to the property records had been submitted for permanent update, ensuring that no future administrative action could reference the invalid construction approvals that had initiated the dispute. That message effectively closed the loop between physical reality and legal recognition, completing the full transition from contested land use to verified ownership integrity. Margaret Hollis and the Homeowners Association Board were now listed in the compliance review docket for procedural assessment, a process that would take place entirely outside the field environment where the events had originally unfolded. There was no further presence from them on the property, only the administrative trace of their actions embedded in official documentation. I stood for a long moment at the boundary marker where everything had first escalated, looking across the vast acreage that had once been divided by assumption and uncertainty. The land itself had not changed, but the framework governing it had been fully corrected, and that distinction defined everything that remained. Sheriff Mercer's final note in the case file stated that the site was to remain in protected status until all legal review stages were complete, ensuring that no unauthorized activity could reappear under any misinterpreted authority claim. As the afternoon light stretched across the open terrain, I realized that the conclusion of this process was not marked by confrontation or removal, but by something far more permanent, the restoration of recorded truth over assumed control. And standing there in the quiet that followed, I understood that the land had never needed to be taken back, only properly recognized for what it had always been under the law.